My property, nestled within the meticulously planned confines of Maplewood Heights, had always been more than just a house. It was a fortress of tranquility, a carefully curated ecosystem of peace built over a decade of painstaking effort. The laws of the suburban kingdom were simple: conformity, quietude, and above all, the inviolability of the property line. My lawn, a deep, emerald green expanse, flowed with a gentle, almost imperceptible grace toward the border with the adjacent lot. This natural slope was not just a visual feature. It was a silent, essential piece of engineering, managing rainwater runoff with ecological precision, a detail only a dedicated homeowner truly appreciates. Into this established, delicate balance, the Millers descended. Their arrival was less an occupation and more an invasion, a loud, immediate, and utterly disruptive testament to aggressive, unchecked ambition. They brought with them the palpable stench of new money entitlement, a belief system that dictated the rules, the laws, and the quiet customs of a neighborhood were subordinate to their singular vision. The Millers' grand plan, as vague rumors and noisy trucks suggested, involved a dramatic reimagining of their entire rear yard. They wanted a sprawling, multi-tiered patio, an outdoor extension of their already oversized home, a structure that demanded a perfectly flat, geometric foundation. The gentle slope, my quiet masterpiece of drainage, was deemed an unacceptable flaw in their vision of concrete perfection. It was this fundamental disagreement with the earth itself that became the genesis of the war. The very first tremor of the coming conflict was subtle, easily missed by the casual observer, but impossible to ignore for a sentinel like myself. One humid afternoon, I walked the perimeter, a ritual I perform every week, checking for weeds, inspecting the mulch, and confirming the status of the sacred boundary markers. These were not conspicuous signs. They were tiny, brass caps, hammered flush into the earth by the original surveyor decades ago, representing the unassailable, recorded word of the county. They were the physical embodiment of the law. On the lot corner nearest the street, the brass cap remained. But as I traced the line toward the rear utility easement, the area where the slope was most pronounced and where the Millers' proposed patio would loom largest, the two key markers had vanished. Not simply covered by date, but meticulously and deliberately extracted. Their removal was calculated and chilling. It was a preemptive elimination of irrefutable, physical evidence. In the void left by the brass, a week later, appeared the first act of tangible aggression: bright orange plastic stakes. They were gaudy, aggressive, and utterly unprofessional. A rough-looking, non-uniform crew, operating with a palpable sense of hurried anonymity, hammered these plastic markers into the ground. These stakes were not placed by a surveyor using a transit. They were placed by a contractor using a tape measure and a client's demanding finger. I knew instantly that these were not measurements of property. They were placeholders for theft. The cold, sickening lurch in my stomach as I knelt down to assess the damage remains vivid. My gardening efforts had always respected the legal line, running parallel to the border of a meticulously maintained bed of perennial flowers. Now, this new orange line plunged inward, cutting a shocking curve into my established territory. I used my own calibrated, professional-grade measuring tape, referencing the fixed point of the utility box and the remaining front brass marker. The verification was immediate and devastating. At the furthest point, near the easement, the orange stakes were a full 3 feet deep into my deeded property. 3 feet. To the average eye, it might seem small, a mere trifle of land. But I saw it differently. I saw a tangible, measurable reduction of my asset, a deliberate act of territorial larceny. This was not a contractor's mistake. This was a purposeful claim, rooted in the Millers' conviction that they could simply impose a new map onto the old one. The rest of that day was consumed by a methodical, solitary investigation. My original plat map, the legal blueprint of my ownership, was spread out across the dining room table, its intricate coordinates a stark contrast to the rough orange plastic outside. I spent hours cross-referencing the fixed points, calculating the exact square footage of the stolen parcel. It amounted to a small but significant reduction in the usable space of my backyard, territory I had paid for, maintained, and valued. The intellectual exercise confirmed the emotional shock. The Millers were not victims of confusion. They were perpetrators of an intentional land grab. Their silence after the removal of the brass markers was proof of their guilty conscience. I wrestled with the decision of how to proceed. My instinct, forged by years of peaceful neighborly relations, was diplomacy. I decided to give them a single, final opportunity to correct their error without escalation. The resulting letter was a masterpiece of controlled neutrality. I typed it meticulously, double-spacing and formatting it like a legal brief. It cited the exact county plat map coordinates, referenced the dates the brass markers disappeared, and requested the immediate removal and correct placement of the encroaching plastic stakes. I ensured every sentence was free of emotion, accusation, or threat, just cold, hard legal fact. I hand-delivered the letter to their mailbox, ensuring I secured a certified confirmation of receipt from the postal carrier. I waited, holding my breath, hoping that the formal language of law would override their arrogance. The Millers' response was the most profound insult of all: absolute, sustained silence. The certified receipt was returned to me, confirming they had received and read my precise legal warning. Yet, the orange stakes remained firmly planted in my soil, defiant markers of their territorial trespass. The lapse of time, a full week of silent refusal, confirmed their intent was hostile, not mistaken. Diplomacy had failed. Courtesy had been treated as weakness. I knew then that I was dealing with a malicious opponent who believed legal boundaries were merely suggestions that could be redrawn with enough aggression. The war for the 3-foot strip of land had begun, and I realized the next phase would be the final, irreversible act of vandalism, the destruction of the innocent witnesses to their crime, my cherished border Azaleas. I began preparations for round 2, knowing the clock was ticking toward the irreversible commitment of concrete. The Millers' contemptuous silence was a drumbeat leading to their first physical assault on my property. They had ignored the legal warning. Now they would commit the first act of irreparable destruction. I knew what was coming, and I prepared my defense with the meticulous planning of a general. The battle plan was simple: document every moment, every shovel of date, every act of vandalism, ensuring the evidence would be irrefutable when presented to a judge. I set up my surveillance rig, a high-definition video camera mounted securely on the second floor, zoomed in with forensic precision on the 3-foot strip of disputed land. This was not casual recording. This was time-stamped, geotagged legal documentation designed to prove willful intent and malice. The machinery arrived shortly after sunrise, a small but powerful bobcat excavator, its tracks scarring the Miller's own driveway as a preview of the destruction to come. The sight of the heavy equipment, poised and ready, sent a wave of cold dread mixed with a potent surge of righteous fury through me. The target was unmistakable: my 50-foot row of mature, decades-old azalea bushes. These plants were the pride of my landscaping, providing not only deep color and aesthetic pleasure, but a vital, natural sound and sight barrier between our properties. They stood directly, innocently, in the path of the Millers' encroaching, illegal boundary. I watched, holding my breath, as the foreman, a man whose face was a mask of deliberate indifference, directed the bobcat's bucket. The machine drove right up to the line of orange stakes and then, with a sickening hydraulic whine, plunged its sharp steel bucket deep into my soil. The sound of the azalea root balls being violently ripped from the earth was horrific, a tearing, rasping noise that felt like a physical violation of my very ownership. The shrubs, thick with established roots that had taken 20 years to anchor, were severed, lifted, and unceremoniously dumped onto a growing, chaotic pile of soil and debris. This was not accidental damage. This was calculated vandalism, a physical clearing of the path for their illegal architecture. They were tearing down my boundary to make room for their fraudulent one. It was during this act of destruction that Mr. Miller chose to make his appearance. He emerged from his house, accompanied by Mrs. Miller, and stood on their side of the disputed line, watching the destruction with an air of detached proprietorship. His presence at the exact moment of the vandalism confirmed his direct supervision and complicity. I descended to the lawn, not to scream or rage, but to make a third, final, and legally potent statement. I approached the line, holding my certified plat map, and spoke in a clear, level, but firm voice, detailing the exact financial and legal liability they were accruing for the willful destruction of surveyed property. Mr. Miller's response was a masterclass in entitled gaslighting. He didn't deny the destruction. He rationalized the theft. He held up a hand to cut me off, refusing to look at the map, and dismissed the entire row of plants as old, diseased eyesores that needed to be replaced by something more modern. He claimed the area was part of an implied easement that his architect had somehow re-established for the neighborhood's collective aesthetic improvement. His words dripped with condescension, suggesting my adherence to legal boundaries was merely a reflection of my outdated tastes. This interaction confirmed the depth of his delusion. He genuinely believed his desire for a larger patio superseded my legally deeded rights. I retreated, my heart heavy with the loss of the plants, but my mind sharpened with a cold, surgical fury. The camera had captured every moment. The bucket plunge, the root tearing, and Miller's smug, dismissive demeanor. I immediately began the second phase of my counterattack, damage assessment. I contacted a specialist horticultural nursery, demanding a written, notarized estimate for the replacement of mature azaleas of a similar vintage, plants that would provide an immediate return to the property's established aesthetic. The resulting figure, detailed in a professional quote, was staggering, a sum in the tens of thousands of dollars. This document was gold. It quantified their malice, transforming the sentimental loss into a massive, undeniable financial liability. The final, terrifying confirmation of the miller's intent arrived later that afternoon. Truckloads of materials were delivered, pallets upon pallets of heavy, industrial-grade cinder blocks, not the light, decorative kind, along with high-strength mortar mix and bundles of rebar. This was not a garden border. This was a physical component of an engineered, load-bearing retaining wall. A structure of this scale was highly regulated, requiring stamped architectural blueprints, engineering reports, and mandatory city inspections. The millers were gathering the components for a felony of real property, and they were racing the clock to build it under the cover of darkness. The scent of freshly turned earth was now being replaced by the dry, acrid dust of cement, signaling the imminent, irreversible construction of a secret wall. I knew the moment they began pouring the concrete, the trespass would be complete and the battle would escalate to the highest legal level. I waited, surveillance running, for the inevitable descent of night. The suspense following the destruction of the Azaleas was an oppressive, anxiety-inducing weight. I knew the millers, driven by their schedule and their hubris, would not hesitate. They had amassed their materials, the gray, unforgiving bulk of the cinder blocks and the bags of concrete mix, and they had executed the landscaping removal. The next logical and most terrifying step was the irreversible commitment of concrete. I became a sleepless sentinel, my focus entirely fixed on the boundary, knowing the exact moment of the trespass would likely be masked by the cover of darkness and the quiet desperation of an unpermitted crew. I had installed a specialized, low-light surveillance camera system strategically positioned high above the disputed area. This system was not for security. It was for legal evidence gathering, programmed to record in high definition and automatically timestamp every single frame. I knew the millers would not only try to steal land, but they were trying to build a secret structure, bypassing all municipal scrutiny. This video would be the unassailable proof of their criminal intent. The chosen night was dark, humid, and conveniently late on a Tuesday, a time when noise ordinances were generally more lax and neighbors less vigilant. Around 11:30 p.m., the soft, muffled sounds began. Not the loud, expected clamor of daytime construction, but the low, mechanical whine of a portable cement mixer being carefully wheeled into position on the miller's side of the line. Then came the hush thud of tools and the low, urgent voices of men speaking in short, non-English sentences, a clear indication that this was not the primary, licensed contractor they had used for the initial grading, but a separate, shadow crew hired purely for speed and deniability. I settled in at my monitor, my internal tension ratcheting up with every subtle sound. The millers had set up powerful, temporary halogen work lights, casting an eerie, clinical glare over the scene of their crime. The light was harsh, exposing the hasty trenches a crew had dug for the footings. These trenches, I immediately noticed, were laughably shallow, no more than a foot deep, and lacked the required gravel base or proper preparation stipulated by any retaining wall code. They were simply shallow, horrid cuts into the earth, but they were undeniably on my side of the fluorescent orange stakes, deep into my property. The ultimate violation began when the first wet, gray concrete was poured. I watched, my camera zoomed in to capture the textural evidence, as the slurry flowed from the mixer, filling the shallow trenches. This was the moment the trespass became permanent, physical, and materially binding. The entire foundation of the structure, the very component designed to bear the earth's weight and define the boundary, was set on my deeded land. They were literally building their home's expansion on my property. The masons worked with a chilling, frantic efficiency. They laid the first course of cinder blocks, the rough, heavy units, slathering thick layers of mortar with quick, unskilled strokes. The wall rose steadily, a monstrous, ugly gray ribbon marching across the length of the boundary. I noted every structural deficiency, the complete absence of weep holes for drainage, the lack of crucial vertical steel rebar reinforcement driven into the foundation, and the flimsy, rush connection between the blocks. This wall was not engineered, it was stacked. It was built not to last, but merely to exist long enough to change the visual reality. The final insult came as the crew stacked a third and final course of blocks, bringing the wall to its 3-foot mandated height. The top layer was quickly capped with a thick troweling of mortar, sealing the crude structure and attempting to give it a false finish. The finished product was an unyielding, permanent visual scar, a jarring, raw block barrier that cut a distinct, ugly line through the smooth, gentle contours of my backyard. It instantly reduced my usable lawn space, cast new shadows, and fundamentally altered the natural flow of the land. By 3:45 a.m., the work was finished. The crew packed up their generators and mixers with the same silent efficiency they had arrived with, their unmarked van melting back into the suburban night. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the subtle, pungent smell of curing cement. The wall stood stark and exposed under the returning darkness, a concrete monument to the miller's fraud. I spent the next 3 hours reviewing the video footage, segmenting the clips to highlight the key violations: the trespass onto my land, the pouring of the footings, the lack of professional preparation, and the use of the anonymous, late-night crew. The footage was irrefutable. It proved the miller's actions were not just illegal, but intentional and covert. By 7 a.m., as the neighborhood began to stir, I had already executed the next crucial step. The urgent request to the counter-certified land surveyor had been placed. I needed the full weight of the legal, state-sanctioned truth to expose the miller's architectural lie. The era of observation was over. The era of legal enforcement was beginning. I knew the wall would come down, but my absolute commitment was to ensure that the millers pay for every block, every hour of labor, and every ounce of stress this act of trespass had cost me. The millers had committed the irreversible error, and the hammer of the law was about to fall. The morning of the official survey was a meticulously planned operation designed to be entirely public, entirely professional, and entirely humiliating for the millers. I had arranged for Mr. Henderson, the certified land surveyor, to arrive precisely at 9 a.m., a time when local traffic and neighborhood activity were at their peak. I wanted every resident, and especially the millers, to witness the cold, clinical application of the law. Mr. Henderson arrived with a full crew, equipped with high-visibility gear, sophisticated GPS and laser transit equipment, and the solemn authority that comes with being an officer of the court when it comes to property lines. The sight of his tripod and reflective vest immediately drew the attention of the millers, who quickly retreated to their rear windows, their previous smug confidence replaced by visible, panicked apprehension. Mr. Henderson began his process with ritualistic precision. He first located the fixed control points of my property and verified them against the county plat map records, establishing the unassailable baseline. He then deployed his laser transit, focusing the beam across the disputed area. He ignored the miller's ugly new wall entirely. His only focus was the immutable legal coordinates of the invisible line between our properties. The moment of truth arrived when he projected the true legal boundary onto the physical structure. Using a kind of vibrant, fluorescent orange spray paint, a color impossible to miss, Mr. Henderson marked the exact trajectory of the legal line. The dots were small, clean, and devastatingly accurate. They ran consistently, unequivocally, 3 full feet away from the face of the concrete wall, squarely within my property. The wall was not near the line. It was in the line. The evidence was visually undeniable, etched in bright paint onto the very land they had stolen. Once the physical demarcation was complete, Mr. Henderson retired to his truck and produced the official document. It was a fresh plat survey, stamped with the seal of the county and certified by his professional signature. Across the diagram, in bold, red, block letters, was a damning annotation: 3.0 feet encroachment of unpermitted retaining wall onto adjacent lot per county records. This document was my ultimate legal weapon, transforming a neighborly grievance into a documented, certifiable crime of real property trespass. Armed with this evidence and the video record of the covert construction, I immediately made a decisive move, bypassing the useless HOA entirely. I called the City Planning and Code Enforcement Department, filing the complaint not as a property line dispute, which they might defer, but as an illegal, unpermitted, and structurally unsound construction project. I provided the name of the surveyor and the certified report number, making their denial impossible. The response was swift. Within the hour, Officer Delgado, the code enforcement officer, arrived. He was everything the millers were not: methodical, objective, and backed by the full force of the municipality. He didn't waste time negotiating. He observed the surveyor's orange marks, noted the fresh concrete, and then focused on the structural requirements. He measured the wall's height, precisely 3 feet, and immediately cross-referenced it with a city ordinance that requires stamped engineering plans and mandatory permitting for any retaining structure exceeding 2 feet in height. The wall failed the code test instantaneously. Officer Delgado demanded the building permit. The millers, through their nervous foreman, offered vague, contradictory excuses. It's pending. It's lost. We thought it was just a garden border. Officer Delgado simply shook his head, his expression cold. The most satisfying visual moment of the entire conflict followed. Officer Delgado reached into his utility kit and produced the largest, brightest, most offensive sticker imaginable, a massive, fluorescent orange vinyl sheet bearing the words "Stop Work Order," unpermitted construction in violation of municipal code. He strode across the painted line and, with a deliberate, firm press, affixed the sticker directly onto the face of the ugly concrete wall. It was a public, non-negotiable decree of illegality. The sticker, visible to every passing car and every anxious window watcher, was a beacon of the miller's shame. It officially commanded that all work cease immediately, and the notice of violation formally initiated daily fines for the failure to cure the violation. The millers had built their wall. The city had just declared it a crime scene. The orange stop work order sticker, starkly visible against the raw gray concrete, was a trigger for the millers' inevitable transition from arrogance to aggressive, desperate retaliation. They were cornered, legally exposed, and absolutely furious that their wealth and ambition had been defeated by a simple government regulation and a conscientious neighbor. Their reaction was a chaotic torrent of legal threats, bureaucratic manipulation, and petty personal warfare. Their first offensive move was a desperate appeal to legal intimidation. Their attorney, clearly operating under the miller's high-pressure direction, immediately launched a barrage of hostile correspondence. I received a sprawling, multi-page cease-and-desist letter, delivered by courier, no less, that was less a legal argument and more a hysterical threat. It falsely accused me of everything from malicious harassment and intentional interference with contractual relations, referencing their crew, to extortion and defamation for having the audacity to call code enforcement. The letter was a transparent attempt to drown me in legal jargon and financial fear, ending with a $500,000 threat of a slander lawsuit if I did not immediately withdraw my city complaint and agree to accept the wall's existence. I filed the letter neatly away, recognizing it not as a legal obstacle, but as Exhibit B, undeniable proof of their malice and intent to harass. Simultaneously, the millers turned their focus to the Homeowners Association, viewing it as a last soft target they could manipulate. They began attending every Architectural Review Committee, ARC, meeting, not to address their violation, but to launch preemptive, character-assassinating attacks against me. They painted me as the unreasonable, overly aggressive neighbor, framing the wall as merely a misunderstanding that was disrupting the harmony of the community. They even tried to argue, absurdly, that the 3 feet of their unpermitted wall was somehow a necessary retaining feature that my property needed. The HOA, true to a predictable nature, performed a masterclass in bureaucratic cowardice. The committee chair, a nervous, older resident known for prioritizing quiet conformity over justice, visited the site. He glanced nervously at the orange sticker and the surveyor's paint, but seemed deliberately blind to the evidence. The HOA's resulting memo was a profound betrayal. They declared the conflict to be a private, civil matter and claimed the association lacked the specific jurisdiction to enforce city building permits or property line disputes. They effectively washed their hands of the crime, refusing to enforce their own covenant requiring adherence to municipal law, thereby giving the millers tacit permission to continue their bad behavior. This failure was a critical turning point for me. It confirmed that fighting the millers through local, self-governing channels was futile. The millers were above the HOA's pay grade. My fight had to be external, legally binding, and ruthlessly enforced. The millers, taking the HOA's non-action as validation, escalated a campaign of personal, petty harassment. This phase was relentless and designed to inflict sleep deprivation and constant low-level anxiety. They aimed powerful, industrial-grade floodlights, the kind used for large construction sites, directly into my bedroom window. Even with thick curtains, the sheer intensity of the light created a constant, irritating glow that severely disrupted my sleep. They then weaponized noise, running their industrial-sized leaf blowers and gas-powered trimmers at precisely 7:01 a.m., 1 minute after the local noise ordinance lifted, directing the full blast of the sound and debris right against the shared boundary. The final, deeply frustrating act of retaliation was their abuse of the HOA complaint system itself. They began flooding the HOA board with a dozen frivolous, ridiculous complaints against me. My porch light was too bright, my grass was 2 millimeters too high, my window treatment caused excessive glare, and my mulch color was suddenly unapproved. This was designed to force me into a constant state of administrative defense, draining my time and energy. I met this avalanche of petty aggression not with counter-anger, but with cold, surgical resolve. I stopped answering their hostile correspondence, filing every letter, every HOA complaint notice, and every photo of the floodlights as evidence of their malicious intent. The floodlights and the noise were not just annoyances. They were now legally categorized as the intentional infliction of emotional distress and private nuisance. I knew I needed a lawyer who operated on their level of ruthlessness, but with the law as his absolute shield. The preparation for the massive civil lawsuit was now the only path forward. My search for legal counsel was an intense, deliberate process of vetting. I needed more than just a real estate lawyer. I needed a pit bull, a specialist in property litigation who understood that this was not about compromise, but about maximum financial accountability. I found him in Mr. Hawthorne, a seasoned litigator renowned for his aggressive, surgical approach and his total lack of patience for the antics of entitled property offenders. I presented Mr. Hawthorne with the entirety of my meticulously organized file, the original plat map, the certified survey with the red ink violation note, the code enforcement notice of violation, the video evidence of the midnight concrete pour, the $10,000 estimate for the mature Azaleas, and the thick file detailing the Millers' campaign of legal threats and personal harassment, the floodlights, the noise, the frivolous complaints. Mr. Hawthorne's initial assessment was validating and electrifying. He confirmed that the Millers' actions constituted not just a boundary dispute, but an aggravated case of willful trespass, malicious destruction of property, and a quantifiable private nuisance. He framed their actions as conspiracy to defraud the city and me, a level of intent that significantly opened the door to massive punitive damages, a financial penalty designed purely to punish them and deter similar behavior. The legal offensive began immediately with the drafting and filing of the civil complaint in County Superior Court. It was a dense, meticulously footnoted document spanning dozens of pages, leaving no transgression unstated. The complaint named both Mr. and Mrs. Miller as defendants, holding them jointly and severally liable for the damages. The core counts were numerous: trespass quare clausum fregit, for the physical encroachment; willful destruction of property, for the Azaleas; creation of an abatable private nuisance; the illegal wall itself; and intentional infliction of emotional distress, for the harassment campaign. The demand for relief was uncompromising. I sought not only the mandatory, immediate, court-ordered removal of the wall, a permanent injunction, and full compensatory damages, the cost of all repairs, surveys, and landscaping, but also a towering sum in punitive damages, a financial penalty so severe it will be unforgettable. The moment the Millers were served the official summons and complaint, delivered by a uniformed, non-negotiable process server right to their front door, the reality of the conflict shifted from a petty neighbor fight to a high-stakes legal war. Their immediate reaction, which I later learned was one of explosive disbelief, confirmed that they genuinely believed their intimidation tactics would shield them from real legal consequences. Mr. Hawthorne's first tactical strike was ancillary but devastatingly effective, a motion for a temporary restraining order, TIO, specifically targeting the Millers' harassment. He presented the judge with the clear evidence of the floodlights and the documentation of the frivolous complaints, arguing that the Millers were actively interfering with my constitutional right to quiet enjoyment of my property. The judge granted the TIO immediately. The order, served the very next day, legally compelled the Millers to immediately cease all retaliatory activities, specifically mentioning the repositioning of exterior lighting and the timed noise pollution. This TIO victory was crucial. It confirmed that the court took my claim seriously and served as a legal muzzle, stripping the Millers of their primary weapons, intimidation and harassment. They were forced to stop their petty war games and prepare to fight a massive, costly lawsuit strictly on the undeniable facts of their illegal, trespassy wall. The legal system was now my instrument of revenge, and the journey toward the Millers' financial ruin was underway. The litigation entered the discovery phase, the most intrusive and often decisive part of any civil lawsuit. This period was my greatest weapon, as it legally forced the Millers to expose the full, ugly truth of their premeditated malice through their own private records. Mr. Hawthorne used this phase with surgical precision, aiming to prove intent beyond a shadow of a doubt. The first volley was a comprehensive set of requests for production of documents, RFPs, and interrogatories. The demands were sweeping, targeting every piece of electronic communication the Millers possessed: emails, text messages, contractor bids, architect consultations, and even communication logs with their HOA attorney. Crucially, we demanded records spanning the entire period from their purchase of the home up to the filing of the lawsuit. The Millers' attorney, predictably, fought the demands tooth and nail, claiming they were overly broad and invasive of privacy. Mr. Hawthorne argued successfully before the judge that the communications were directly relevant to the illegal construction and the Millers' intent, forcing their compliance. The resulting electronic evidence, the digital trail, was a goldmine that irrevocably condemned the Millers. The text message exchanges between Mr. Miller and the foreman of the Midnight Crew were a particularly devastating find. They explicitly detailed the conspiracy: need this wall up ASAP. No need for permits. Skip the city checks. Pay cash when done. Further exchanges confirmed that they had actively dismissed a reputable, licensed landscaping firm that had insisted on a proper survey and permits, specifically opting for the fly-by-night crew because they promised to build under the radar. The evidence proved that the trespass was not a mistake, but a calculated, deliberate act of law-breaking intended to maximize the size of their own patio deck. The production of their own architectural plans and survey documents also proved highly damaging. We discovered that the Millers' original, permitted plans showed their patio structure terminating precisely at the legal boundary. However, In private email exchanges with their unlicensed builder, they had discussed how stealing 3 feet of my land would allow them to accommodate a specific, oversized outdoor kitchen unit they desired. This exposed the greedy, premeditated motivation behind the trespass. The final, humiliating act of discovery was the Millers' mandatory depositions. Under oath, in a sterile conference room, Mr. Hawthorne relentlessly cross-examined them, using their own text messages and documents against them. Mr. Miller was forced to admit, line by line, that he knew a 3-foot retaining wall required a permit, that he intentionally paid a non-licensed crew in cash to avoid city scrutiny, and that he had been warned about a boundary line by his first contractor. Mrs. Miller were compelled to admit that their aggressive HOA complaints were filed purely out of revenge, and that the lights were aimed at my house intentionally to make a point. The deposition transcripts were the legal smoking gun. They transformed the case from a technical boundary dispute into a definitive case of intentional malice, fraud, and a conspiracy to destroy property. The Millers had already condemned themselves through their own digital records and sworn testimony. The total, comprehensive annihilation of their defense were complete, leaving the court with no factual dispute left to consider. With discovery completed and the Millers' defense utterly destroyed by their own electronic evidence and deposition testimony, Mr. Hawthorne wasted no time. He filed a motion for summary judgment, a legal maneuver arguing that based on the undisputed facts, the certified trespass, the admitted lack of permits, and the Millers' sworn testimony proving malicious intent, no reasonable jury could find in their favor. A full trial was simply a waste of the court's time. The hearing for the motion was a moment of profound, cold justice. The presiding judge, having reviewed the extensive documentation, the surveyor's report, the video timeline of the illegal construction, and the Millers' own incriminating text exchanges, did not mince words. He delivered an oral ruling that was both comprehensive and scorching. He declared the Millers' actions constituted a clear, undisputed case of willful and continuous trespass and an unlawful private nuisance. He explicitly stated that the Millers' defense was meritless and their testimony was lacking in all credibility, citing their own text as proof of a deliberate, fraudulent effort to violate municipal code and seize their neighbor's land. The ruling culminated in the issuance of the mandatory injunctive order for abatement. This was the ultimate, non-negotiable death sentence for the secret wall. The order commanded the Millers to secure a licensed, bonded demolition crew, remove the entire illegal retaining wall and its footings, and fully restore the grade of my property within an ironclad deadline of 30 calendar days. The order was not a suggestion. It was an enforceable decree. It explicitly warned that failure to comply would result in the court authorizing me to hire the crew, with all resulting costs, plus statutory interest and heavy penalties, immediately charged back to the Millers and secured by a non-dischargeable lien on their property. This ruling was a total legal and psychological victory. The Millers had relied on intimidation and concrete to assert their dominance. The law responded by issuing an unyielding, mandatory decree of demolition and financial liability. The judge had not merely decided the boundary. He had confirmed the Millers' status as willful lawbreakers, condemning their creation as an illegal structure that had to be physically erased. The 30-day countdown to the dismantling of their concrete hubris had begun, ensuring their defeat would be both public and financially ruinous. The definitive summary judgment and the court-ordered deadline did nothing to quell the Millers' inherent arrogance. They merely channeled it into a series of desperate, self-destructive maneuvers designed to delay the inevitable. Facing the 30-day demolition clock, they chose contemptuous resistance over compliance, showcasing their deep-seated inability to accept responsibility. Their first official act was a desperate, emergency appeal of the mandatory injunctive order. Their attorney argued that the demolition would cause irreparable harm to the Millers' planned outdoor kitchen. The appellate court, reviewing the lower court's comprehensive findings, swiftly and summarily denied their emergency motion, pointing out that the harm was self-inflicted and that the demolition was necessary to abate an illegal, trespassy structure. This futile appeal added tens of thousands of dollars to their burgeoning legal debt and confirmed the unassailable finality of the judgment. Simultaneously, Mr. Miller attempted a bizarre, last-ditch act of architectural obfuscation. He hired an inexpensive local painter to coat the ugly gray cinder block wall with a neutral beige masonry coat, attempting to disguise the illegal structure as a finished, aesthetic component. His hope was to make the demolition seem like an act of wanton destruction against a finished structure. I immediately alerted Mr. Hawthorne, who filed a swift motion for enforcement, citing the action as an intentional attempt to obfuscate a court-ordered nuisance. The judge, clearly annoyed by the continued defiance, issued a sharp addendum to the order, explicitly stating that painting the trespass does not negate the trespass and warning that any further alteration designed to impede the mandatory removal would lead to an immediate contempt charge, potentially resulting in personal fines or even arrest. Their final, most ridiculous, and most contemptuous maneuver involved attempting to complicate the demolition itself. The Millers hired a welder to begin attaching metal base plates to the top of the illegal wall, suggesting they were laying the groundwork for a decorative fence. The clear intent was to fuse a wall to a supposedly new structure, thus making the demolition process more expensive and damaging. I documented the work immediately. Mr. Hawthorne filed an ex parte motion, a motion heard without the other party present due to the urgency of the contempt. The result was instantaneous and spectacular. A uniformed deputy sheriff was dispatched to the Millers' property, serving a second, highly specific restraining order that explicitly prohibited any and all physical contact or modification of the illegal wall. The deputy stood watch as the welder was summarily ordered to cease work and leave the property, cementing the public spectacle of the Millers' absolute legal defeat and their failed contempt. The Millers were now completely checkmated, legally restrained from touching the wall and financially compelled to remove it. Their every attempt to resist had only magnified the cost of their defeat. I was instructed to finalize a contract with a demolition company, ensuring the highest standards of professional work and, consequently, the highest costs would be applied, all of which would be meticulously billed directly to the Millers. The countdown was reaching 0, and the stage was set for the physical execution of justice. The 30th day arrived. The Millers, stubborn to the last, had failed to secure or hire their own demolition crew, clearly hoping for a last-minute miracle or procedural error. The clock struck midnight, marking their official default on the court order. Mr. Hawthorne immediately gave the final authorization to the contractor I had chosen, a high-end, specialized firm known for its professional, high-cost work. The arrival of the crew was meticulously timed for 8 a.m. on a Tuesday, ensuring maximum exposure. The machinery was massive, modern, and professional. A large dump truck, a mini excavator with a powerful hydraulic hammer attachment, and a team of uniformed, insured workers. This was the antithesis of the Millers' shadowy, midnight crew. I had strategically placed small, professional signs near the property line stating, "Court-ordered abatement of illegal structure." This ensured that the noise and disruption were understood by the neighborhood to be an act of legal enforcement, not just construction. The noise began with a deafening, rhythmic rat-a-tat of the jackhammer against the beige-painted concrete, the powerful, unmistakable soundtrack of justice being served. The Millers, unable to face the spectacle, immediately drew their blinds and sealed themselves within their home, forced to listen to the systematic destruction of their own arrogance. The demolition was slow and methodical, adhering to strict, safety-first protocols that, predictably, increased the cost. The foreman, treating the site like a forensic scene, carefully peeled away the painted cinder blocks, revealing the shoddy, non-code mortar joints beneath. He confirmed the structural deficiencies, no proper rebar, weak mortar, and dangerously shallow footings that would have undoubtedly collapsed within a few seasons. The ultimate catastrophe, the discovery that fundamentally changed the financial scope of the entire conflict, occurred as the mini-excavator reached the deepest layer of the wall's footings. The operator paused, shouted, and signaled urgently. I rushed out with my camera to witness the scene. The weight of the illegally poured concrete base, which had been set directly over the utility easement, had caused a catastrophic stress fracture in my main 6-inch storm drainage pipe. The pipe, essential for managing runoff from the upper portion of my lawn, was cracked and partially collapsed under the immense, unengineered pressure. This damage was hidden, extensive, and absolutely critical. The Millers' cheap, illegal construction had not just encroached, it had destroyed essential, expensive underground infrastructure. The demolition had to stop immediately. I had the foreman take meticulous, professional photographs showing the concrete mass resting directly on the point of pipe failure. I contacted Mr. Hawthorne and a civil engineer instantly. This discovery was the ultimate financial death blow for the Millers. The massive cost of specialized utility excavation and infrastructure repair was now added to the final, crushing bill they would be forced to pay. The secret wall was gone, but the hidden financial bomb it had concealed was now detonated. The discovery of the compromised storm drainage pipe immediately catapulted the dispute from a property trespass case into a high-stakes infrastructure and environmental damage claim. The implications were immense, far exceeding the initial cost of the wall's removal and landscaping. The narrator's first action was decisive, securing the services of a certified civil and environmental engineer who specialized in site drainage and utility damage assessment. The engineer's on-site inspection was meticulous and spanned 2 full days. Using specialized ground-penetrating radar, GPR, and internal pipe cameras, he confirmed the extent of the disaster. The report, delivered with the gravity of a medical diagnosis, was a devastating indictment of the Millers' negligence. The structural analysis showed that the illegal wall's shallow footings, combined with the weight of the retained soil, had created excessive differential pressure directly on the pipe, causing a catastrophic longitudinal fracture over a 25-foot section. This fracture was not merely a slow leak. It was a bottleneck, causing water to pool and threaten the integrity of my lower lawn and, critically, my basement foundation during heavy rain events. The engineer's certified report was precise about the necessary remediation. The fix required complex, costly work, full excavation of the damaged trench, requiring specialized equipment to avoid further contamination, the replacement of the compromised pipe with commercial-grade, reinforced PVC, and stabilization of the surrounding soil using geotechnical fabrics and specialized aggregate backfill. The estimated cost for the specialized utility repair alone was staggeringly high, a massive six-figure sum that dwarfed the initial cost of replacing the Azaleas. The report explicitly stated that the damage was a direct and foreseeable consequence of unpermitted, non-code construction. Armed with the engineer's report and the eye-watering repair estimate, Mr. Hawthorne wasted no time. He filed an emergency motion to amend the complaint in the civil case. The new filing added a devastating count, gross negligence resulting in damage to essential property infrastructure. The narrator was now seeking the entire cost of the engineering assessment, the massive excavation and replacement costs, plus dramatically increased punitive damages due to the demonstrable recklessness of the Millers' actions. The legal argument was undeniable. The Millers' failure to secure a $500 permit had cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars in liability. The Millers' attorney, receiving the amended complaint, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. The possibility of insurance covering the damage was minimal, as the policy would certainly contain exclusion for damage caused by illegal, unpermitted construction. The Millers were facing a total financial wipeout. Their attorney advised them, with no ambiguity, that continued litigation was suicide. Their only option was immediate, comprehensive settlement, accepting the narrator's terms entirely to avoid a jury trial where they would be found liable for all costs plus massive punitive penalties. The Millers' defensive wall had collapsed. Their financial one was next. While the legal negotiation tables were set, the physical reality on the boundary remained a testament to the Millers' incompetence and trespass. The enormous, exposed trench, cordoned off with bright orange warning tape and marked by the shattered section of a utility pipe, remained for nearly a week. I ensured this unsightly, yet critical, eyesore remained visible for maximum community impact. It was a physical embodiment of the Millers' financial crime. I maintained a posture of quiet, factual transparency. When curious neighbors approached, and many did, drawn by the shocking spectacle of the excavation and the heavy machinery, I offered no inflammatory language, only cold, technical facts. I calmly explained that the unpermitted concrete structure had crushed the main utility storm drain, requiring specialized, expensive engineering repair. This was crucial. I didn't frame it as, my neighbor is mean. I framed it as, my neighbor's criminal activity has damaged public infrastructure. This narrative was highly effective. The initial sympathy some might have harbored for the Millers, viewing them as victims of an overly aggressive neighbor, evaporated entirely. The Millers were no longer just petty. They were seen as irresponsible actors whose actions threatened the property values and safety of the entire community. Their arrogance had literally manifested as structural danger. The HOA, in a state of utter panic over their own potential liability for failing to enforce their covenant, was forced into a massive public course correction. Under pressure from the community, the board issued a formal, deeply apologetic public statement. The statement acknowledged the severity of the drainage damage and confirmed, in writing, that the construction was unpermitted and illegal, validating every claim I had made from day one. This was a profound institutional victory, turning the very body that had abandoned me into a formal instrument of the Millers' humiliation. The Millers, sealed behind their drawn blinds, were subjected to the ultimate public shaming, passive, forced observation of their own defeat. They could not leave their house without walking past the raw excavation, the trench that held the evidence of their negligence. They were financially compelled to pay for the repair, but the entire process was managed by my contractors and my lawyer, ensuring they had zero control over the spectacle of their own forced compliance. The shame was total, final, and inescapable, setting the stage for the maximum financial penalty in the upcoming settlement negotiations. The settlement negotiation was not a legal compromise. It was a one-sided financial execution. Mr. Hawthorne entered the mediation room with absolute confidence, armed with a certified survey, the video of the midnight build, the engineer's six-figure repair estimate, and the Miller's own deposition testimony proving malicious intent. The Miller's attorney, knowing he had zero defense, could only plead for mercy and attempt to minimize the bleeding. Mr. Hawthorne's position was utterly unyielding. He rejected every attempt by the Millers' Council to offer a lowball cash settlement or to shift responsibility to their unpermitted contractor. His terms were non-negotiable and comprehensive: full compensation for every single cost incurred, payment of maximum punitive damages, and payment of every dollar of my legal fees. The final settlement agreement was a document of profound financial devastation for the Millers. They were compelled to sign an agreement committing to a staggering multi-six-figure cash payment. This amount was structured to ensure maximum punishment. 1. Full compensatory damages, covering the complete cost of the specialized drainage repair, the full demolition cost, the replacement of the mature Azaleas, using the highest nursery quote, and all engineer and surveyor fees. 2. Punitive damages, a massive, separate financial penalty, designed explicitly to punish their malice, calculated based on the severity of the trespass and the reckless infrastructure damage. 3. Legal indemnification, the payment of all my accrued attorney fees and litigation costs, ensuring my total legal expense of the entire ordeal was zero. Crucially, the narrator demanded and received several non-monetary, humiliating concessions that ensured the permanence of their defeat. 1. A sworn, notarized affidavit of trespass and damage, a formal document signed by the Millers, publicly admitting their illegal construction, trespass, and responsibility for the damage. This document will be recorded with a county recorder, forever attaching their legal wrongdoing to the public title history of their home. 2. A binding covenant, an agreement prohibiting them from building any retaining structure or fence on the shared boundary for the entire duration of their ownership of the property. 3. A written apology, a formal letter of apology for the distress caused, required as a final, symbolic act of submission. The settlement check was a massive transaction, requiring the Millers to drain their savings, liquidate investments, and likely secure a second, high-interest mortgage on their house, a true sacrifice that ensured the punishment was proportional to the crime. The Millers had attempted to steal a piece of land. The narrator had reclaimed the land and extracted a total, crippling financial forfeiture. The legal battle was concluded. The physical restoration was about to commence, fully funded by the vanquished. With the massive settlement funds now secured in the attorney's trust account, I initiated the final, most satisfying phase, the full, comprehensive physical restoration of the boundary. This process was not merely about repairing the damage. It was about erasing every physical trace of the Millers' aggression and reasserting the serene, natural order of my property. The project began with the most critical, complex phase, the utility repair. Specialized contractors, selected for their meticulous precision, worked under the constant supervision of the civil engineer. They carefully completed the deep excavation, replacing the cracked storm drain pipe with reinforced, commercial-grade PVC and meticulously sealing the joints. They then backfilled the trench using compacted, stabilized aggregate, creating a utility system that was superior and far more resilient than the original. The engineer's final sign-off certified that the infrastructure was restored to a higher standard, ironically, thanks to the Millers' money. Next came the architectural restoration of the land itself. The landscaping crew brought in truckloads of high-quality, screened topsoil. Using laser-level measurements taken directly from the original plat, they meticulously regraded the entire area. Every contour of the earth was smoothed, eliminating the jagged lines left by the demolition in the trenches, restoring the gentle, natural slope of the land that the Millers had sought to destroy with their illegal terracing. The boundary was returned to its intended, seamless flow. The final, aesthetically pleasing act was a re-landscaping. The nursery delivered the replacement azaleas, specimen-grade plants sourced for their maturity and identical color to the destroyed bushes. I personally supervised their careful planting, ensuring they were positioned precisely along the legally restored boundary line, providing an instant return to the property's lush, mature aesthetic. High-grade, instant roll sod was then laid across the entire repaired area, knitting the lawn back together with a uniform, deep green carpet that blended flawlessly with the existing grass. The transformation was absolute. Where there had been an ugly, illegal concrete scar, an open, hazardous trench, and a constant source of anxiety, there was now a seamless, thriving expanse of green and foliage. The physical victory was complete. The property was restored, legally secured, aesthetically enhanced, and the entire endeavor was financed by the very neighbors who had tried to steal and destroy it. The successful reconstruction was a quiet, daily monument to the power of the law. The completion of the restoration marked the formal beginning of the Millers' social and psychological collapse within Maplewood Heights. The demolition, the massive utility repair, and the expensive, meticulous re-landscaping, all clearly funded by their forced settlement, served as an undeniable, public declaration of their guilt and defeat. The Millers became instant, permanent pariahs. They were not merely disliked, they were actively, aggressively avoided. When Mrs. Miller walked her dog, neighbors would abruptly cross the street or turn into a driveway, avoiding all eye contact. Mr. Miller's attempts to wave or make small talk were met with silence and averted gazes. Their aggressive confidence had curdled into palpable desperation and shame. Their house, once the symbol of their ambitious renovation, became a silent fortress of their defeat, its curtains perpetually drawn. The humiliation was compounded by the institutional acknowledgement of their failure. The HOA, thoroughly chastened by the legal clarity of the event, made a formal, institutional apology for their earlier cowardice. They adopted a comprehensive new policy requiring mandatory pre-approval and city permit verification for all construction above a certain height, effectively codifying my victory into the community's governing documents. The narrator, having forced the issue to its absolute legal conclusion, was now recognized as a quiet champion of property rights. The narrator's demeanor remained one of calm, professional detachment. When asked about the dispute, I simply referred to the court settlement and the necessity of repairing the damaged storm drain. There was no need for gloating. The objective reality of the restored boundary, the thriving Azaleas, and the massive financial penalty the Millers had paid were a constant, visible reminder of their catastrophic mistake. They were living in a house that was now intrinsically tied to a disastrous, high-profile lawsuit, their home permanently tarnished by their own hubris. The social isolation was merely the daily, lived consequence of their legal failure. Even after the massive settlement funds were paid, the financial shockwaves continued to ripple through the Millers' lives, ensuring the punishment was not a one-time event, but a sustained, crippling economic reality. The size of the settlement had necessitated the Millers securing a second, high-interest mortgage, a debt they were now forced to service simply because they tried to steal 3 feet of land. The narrator, through Mr. Hawthorne, maintained a relentless financial vigilance. The settlement agreement mandated that the Millers pay for any cost overruns related to the repairs. Sure enough, the specialized utility work and the mature Azalea replacement slightly exceeded the initial estimate. A final invoice, meticulously detailed and completely legal, was promptly submitted to the Millers' attorney. Every penny of the final cost was extracted, ensuring the Millers paid for every screw, every bag of aggregate, and every hour of professional labor. The financial pressure was psychological torture. The Millers had to look at a beautifully restored boundary, which represented a 6-figure investment, and know that every perfect blade of grass, every thriving flower, was funded directly by their own strained assets. Their own property, meanwhile, began to show subtle signs of neglect. The ambitious landscaping plans they had initially promised were abandoned entirely, a direct result of their drained finances. Mr. Miller, in a final, pathetic display of his shattered ego, attempted one last legal maneuver by sending a frivolous letter to the HOA claiming the narrator's new azaleas were now too tall, and therefore encroaching visually. The HOA, now terrified of my legal team, immediately forwarded the letter to Mr. Hawthorne. The response was a simple, scathing one-sentence letter. Refer to the binding, recorded affidavit of trespass signed by your clients. Any future frivolous claim will be met with a motion for sanctions. The attempt was instantly neutralized and served only to remind the Millers that their every move was monitored and legally checkmated. The debt, combined with a legal checkmate, ensured their continued residency was unsustainable. The financial and social burden on the Millers became unbearable, turning their expensive house into a gilded cage. Their life in Maplewood Heights had become a daily, public penance. I observed their decline with clinical detachment, recognizing the final stages of a broken will. Their attempt to re-engage socially was met with immediate, chilling failure. Mrs. Miller tried to host a small gathering, clearly hoping to break the social quarantine. Only 2 couples, both newcomers who were unaware of the full scope of the scandal, tentatively attended. The narrator simply ensured the music on the boundary was a few decibels lower than usual and the lights were perfectly dimmed, a subtle demonstration that their every action was within the narrator's awareness and control, forcing them to remain acutely aware of their proximity to their victim. The physical state of their property began to mirror their mental state. The elaborate renovation that had started the dispute stalled entirely. Expensive, half-finished projects, an empty pad for the pool they intended to build, an unpaved section of the patio, sat abandoned, visible symbols of their financial drain. The Millers had the ambition, but they no longer possessed the resources to complete their entitled vision. The Millers' only contact with the outside world became essential errands. They lived in isolation, paying a premium to occupy a space that served as a constant, crushing reminder of their loss. The narrator knew that this phase of prolonged, unavoidable discomfort was a necessary final punishment, a consequence that went beyond the monetary fine. They were trapped, forced to endure the beautiful perfection of the boundary they had paid to restore, while their own ambitions lay in ruins. The relentless pressure meant one thing was certain: their residency was temporary. The narrator began to research local real estate trends and the typical time frame for distressed, high-end property sales, preparing for the final, inevitable development. The first definitive crack in the Miller's fortress of denial appeared on a cool Wednesday afternoon. A sleek, black luxury SUV, bearing the distinctive logo of the most exclusive local real estate agency, pulled into their driveway. A professional, highly polished realtor, a person clearly accustomed to discreet, high-value transactions, spent 2 hours inside the Miller's home, carrying a thick portfolio and leaving with a somber expression. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, confirming what everyone had long suspected. The Millers were attempting to liquidate their asset and escape the neighborhood they had ruined. Their financial and social burden had finally reached its breaking point. The narrator's response was not reactive, but strategically proactive. I knew the Millers would attempt a quick, quiet sale, hoping to minimize disclosure and maximize the price. My defense was already prepared. State law required the Millers to disclose all material fact to potential buyers, and the recorded affidavit of trespass, the history of the code enforcement violation, and the massive civil lawsuit were all highly material. I prepared a comprehensive, multi-page, fact-based document that contained a chronological, emotionless timeline of the entire dispute. This document cited only public court records, case numbers, and the official code enforcement file. It was a weapon of pure transparency. My plan was simple. When the house went on the market and any interested buyer or their agent inquired about the boundary or the recent landscaping, I would calmly offer this document, ensuring that the Millers could not whitewash their history. The legal stigma attached to their property would be preserved, preventing them from achieving a clean exit. The realtors continued. Frequent visits over the following weeks and the resulting palpable tension in the Millers' home confirmed that the process was fraught with difficulties. The Millers' attempt to sell quietly was being sabotaged by their own history, forcing them to confront the true market value consequence of their arrogance. The Millers' attempt at a quiet, off-market sale ultimately failed. No sophisticated buyer was willing to proceed without a massive price reduction, deterred by the recorded affidavit of trespass and the recent history of high-stakes civil litigation. The Millers were forced to accept the painful reality. Their house had a permanent, legal scar that drastically reduced its value. Finally, one Saturday morning, the final, undeniable public admission of their defeat was installed. A crew from a major brokerage hammered a large, unmistakable for-sale sign deep into the Millers' front lawn. The sign was not just an advertisement. It was a physical manifestation of their total financial and social failure, visible to every resident and passerby. The initial listing price was noticeably and significantly below market value for similar, unblemished homes in Maplewood Heights, a clear acknowledgement of the legal discount the property now carried. The narrator's strategy during the viewing period was one of passive, absolute legal transparency. When buyers and realtors came through, they would inevitably be drawn to the beautifully restored boundary and the thriving Azaleas, prompting questions about the recent work. I simply referred them to the public county records and offered a prepared timeline document, confirming the court-ordered nature of the demolition and the financial extent of the settlement. There was no need for venom. The facts spoke for themselves, and the facts were damning. The house sat on the market for an unusually long time. The Millers were forced to endure months of constant scrutiny, open houses, and the slow, painful realization that their single act of arrogance had not only cost them their immediate finances, but had also severely devalued their most significant asset. They were paying the ultimate price for their hubris, forced to sell their home at a massive loss, all because they attempted to steal 3 feet of land they never got to keep. The narrator's victory was now written onto the market value of the Millers' property, ensuring the punishment was financial, public, and total. The day of the Millers' final, inevitable departure was a quiet, almost solemn occasion. The house, which had once been a source of overwhelming disruption and conflict, was being vacated with silence and humiliation. I watched the scene with a deep sense of vindication and closure. Their transportation was telling. A single, large rental U-Haul truck, parked hastily in the driveway, a stark contrast of professional moving service and parade of luxury cars that had accompanied their arrogant arrival. The Millers themselves emerged intermittently, pale, defeated, and utterly devoid of the aggressive entitlement that had defined their time in the neighborhood. They loaded their belongings quickly, avoiding all eye contact with the neighboring houses. Their body language was one of abject surrender. The aggression, the entitlement, and the noise that had plagued the boundary were leaving with the contents of the truck. They were forced to abandon the house they had tried to remake through trespass, leaving behind their massive, unfinished patio projects as silent monuments to their financial ruin. As a large U-Haul finally pulled away from the curb, turning the corner and vanishing from the quiet streets of Maplewood Heights, an immediate, profound sense of peace settled over the narrator's property. The tension that had hung over the neighborhood for years, the anxiety of confrontation, the stress of litigation, the noise of illegal construction, dissipated instantly. The narrator walked out to the backyard lawn one last time. The boundary was perfect. The new sod was established. The azaleas were thriving, and the gentle slope was seamless and perfectly defined by the legal markers. The air was quiet, the sunlight unblemished by the threat of a trespass. The legal process had worked perfectly. The trespass was punished, the property was restored, the financial damages were recovered, and the aggressors had been expelled from the territory they tried to conquer. The narrator had their peace, their perfect boundary, and the ultimate, undeniable victory, a victory written in the full financial forfeiture of the arrogant neighbors who had dared to build a secret, ugly concrete wall. The final piece had returned.